Good. So, thank you for inviting me to the Black Hat sessions. If I'm to believe the first speaker, our esteemed guest, I shouldn't even be welcome to these kinds of things because I'm just, a consultant, and I feel very humbled in the presence of all these technical people. Thanks for the introduction. As said, I do red teaming, and I'm assuming, I'm going out on a limb here, that a lot of you know a fair bit about red teaming already, sort of what it is, and at least how to do it in the technical realm. And I'm here to rather more talk about how we view it from outside of just the technical realm, and bring hopefully a few lessons from the way we look at red teaming back to you. That's rather what I would like to talk about. So, what is it? I like to see red teaming as a method of countering surprise, really the only method I know of to counter surprise. And the demand for an adversary perspective of your own systems has been around for a long time. It's nothing new, so to speak. You could go back to Sun Tzu, who said things like, know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the outcome of a very large amount of battles. But from there, I'd say it has evolved in many ways to what it is today. Through the Kriegspieler, or wargaming of the 1800s, through to red teaming in the military sense as we know it today. So I'd like to just quickly run through those and point out a thing that I think isn't pointed out enough. That the Prussians, rather, not the Russians, the Prussians, the pre-Germans, if you will, were rather good at it. They're Kriegspieler. And in the 1820s, if you read back into the stories, they were doing this quite well. And by the 1860s, pretty much everybody they did battle with thought, well, we better get into that game because they're getting rather good at the whole war thing. To this day, this is a new picture. You can actually buy the Kriegspiel as they played it back then to learn about it. But when we came to the First World War, we saw a weakness to red teaming as it was performed. If you look at the First World War, you have all these beautiful battles with people moving up in lines and trenches, and that was all rather well thought out, but it didn't really prepare for new technologies. New weaponry and airplanes and gas were things that were not part of the rule set of the Kriegspiel back then. So it really rather went out of fashion for a while, until a more modern perspective, we moved into the Cold War era, where we had two parties that were, more or less, we call them like the same size. We don't really have that kind of warfare anymore. And there was a huge cloak and dagger game going on. There was very little known about the means and intentions, as Ralph pointed out, of your opponent. So, well, how do you make your battle plans if you're unsure about these things? Well, the only way you can do it is to imagine what they might be, to train some of your own people to try to think like the opponent and really play the game with you, to see if your plans are really any good. A more modern perspective, I'd say, is when we get into the era of modern military surprises. You could look at maybe Pearl Harbor, a little bit more recently, 9/11. I know security consultants love to talk about 9/11 because it changed the game for all of us and finally gave us a bit of cheese on our sandwich, as the Dutch would say. In the 9/11 Commission report, red teaming was around in America, in law even, for military operations and security. Before 9/11, it was done. And a question they asked themselves after 9/11 was, well, how did we not anticipate this scenario? It was a failure of our imagination. We did not imagine that an opponent could do, or would decide to do, or even have the motivation and the means to do what they did in 2001. And it's not just a failure of imagination. This fellow, Bogdan Zakovic, I'm sure I'm terribly mangling that name, he was, prior to 9/11, the Federal Aviation Administration's red team leader. And he famously said during the hearings after 9/11, what happened on 9/11 was not a failure of the system, but it was a system designed for failure. Because he knew in the years leading up to 9/11 that he reckoned 90% of the red teaming penetration tests he did on the FAA security at airports easily succeeded. Easily. And the reaction to that was, as you might expect, the Federal Aviation Administration suddenly decided to put a whole lot of money into the security system and fix all the problems, right? No, they started ignoring these reports because there were too many, and it's quite painful to think about what you're doing wrong if you've paid a lot of money to try to do it right. For that reason, I think I'm quite glad that I've been invited to talk before the technical guys, because if the people who find the failures don't communicate correctly with the people who pay for fixing the failures, we're not getting anywhere, really. Around the same time, so we're talking about, so not just talking to our managers and getting them to listen to the problems, but we're talking about trying to look into the surprise. Try to figure out what the bad guy's going to do before he's made up his mind on what he's going to do. And we get to this guy, the original Donald, if you will. Fairly similar in reputation, maybe. And he very famously said during a press hearing or a press meeting about the lack of evidence that the Americans had linking Iraq to the production or buying of weapons of mass destruction, about the failure of this evidence. He famously said, "Reports that say that something has not happened are always interesting to me because, as you know, there are known knowns." Now we start to go off the track a little bit. There are things we know, and we also know there are known unknowns. There are things we know we do not know. All right, Donald, gotcha. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones that we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and that of other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. Now, he won a prize for this speech, for being like the most convoluted politician talk for that year. But he also set a bunch of people thinking. Slavoj Žižek actually loves what he said. He talks about it at length. And there's a couple of Dutch people, Guillaume de Valk at the University of Amsterdam, and a colleague of his in the Dutch defense, developed what they call the Rumsfeld matrix. Here we go. Because you can plot these things out in a matrix. There's a fourth category that he didn't mention, the things we don't know that we know, which gets even weirder. And they use this because what Guillaume de Valk did as his research was, he looked into intelligence failures. Why do intelligence agencies make mistakes? Because very often, even to this day, you will hear, yeah, this awful thing happened, and it turns out now they already had all the information on the guy before it happened. Why can't we make up our minds? There's a lot of research on that. I really can't go into it for the time. But an important thing to do is to plot out all of the ways in which you have approached a problem. So the things you know. Yes, all your assumptions, all of the things that you take for granted and you think you know. Have you tested them for their truthfulness? The things you don't know, the question you want answered. The things you don't know you already know. That's that database full of information about all the bad guys, and it's growing. And then there's that last one, the things we don't know. That's that last bit of space at the end of the process where you're thinking about, well, what else might there be? And how do you answer that question? That's a good question. So, for example, if we take an airport, I mean, we know a lot of ways in the past in which airports have been attacked. So we take all of that information and we look at, well, how relevant is it still? Is it even feasible considering the security at our airport? And we teach that to our security, be it our staff or our processes or whatever. And we teach them to look for the things that might happen. not the people that might do it. Because we know somebody might come and do something we don't want them to do. We just don't know when it is, who it is, what they look like. So that's your known unknown, trying to answer that. We have so much information about our passengers and the ways in which, in the past, criminals have done things, that we can start to feed that into a computer, leave it alone for a little bit, and get all these correlations out that really maybe we don't even know why they're correlated, but it might be a good idea to take that up into our processes as well. But then there's the things we don't know we don't know. We haven't answered that question. That's when we get Bogdan and his team of red teamers, preferably to talk to a couple of criminals or terrorists, and think, given the security situation as it is at this airport, in what ways might we still succeed that they haven't looked at yet? And I know apparently it's not a popular opinion, but we're forcing the criminals to innovate. And in that room of innovation, we can innovate with them because it's fairly easy. A criminal will usually figure out a way to do it that has the highest rate of success and the lowest chance of failure, and that is within his means. So there's really only a certain set of things that might happen. So you look at a vital infrastructure organization. Well, I evaluate all my existing knowledge and assumptions on people that might want to attack my infrastructural organization. How have they done it in the past? What is their motivation? Can I even play into their motivation, make them want something else? Or is their motivation such a thing that if I reach a certain level of security, they'll just go somewhere else because I'm not the only person or the only place where they can reach their goal? That's the thing about security. I'm not trying to catch the bad guys. I'm trying to make them go somewhere else. And from that, we develop warnings and indicators so that we can upgrade our security given the moments where we see that something might be happening, considering all the ways we know that it might happen. The big data tooling thing, it's really more your forte than mine. It looks a lot the same like in the airport. I mean, we have a lot of information. So much information that very often the correlations that come out of it, we don't even know why they are there. And then finally, we get a team together of guys who like breaking stuff. And we give them all the security plans and we tell them, well, here it is. Now tell me the easiest 5 ways to mess this up. And tell me of our assumptions, which of them are right and which of them might we have to look at again. And tell me of our indicators, which of them actually indicate that something might be happening and which of them are noise. You cannot measure how much there is you don't know. That's a problem. You know your perception of the potential problems, and you know that there is more problems than you perceive. So we're working into a field where in the past I have triggered a bunch of scientists into getting very angry at me, where I say, well, listen, I consider there might be a problem, and I might act on that problem 100 times, and 99 out of the 100 times I might be wrong. They say, well, that's not really good science. I say, you're right. It's not science. It's security. I'm not too bothered with knowing for sure that a warning indicator is always going to be related to a security, an impending security problem. But if I know that indicator might be related to that problem, and the problem is big enough, I will always act on it. I'm not trying to prove stuff. I'm trying to make sure stuff doesn't happen. And that's where I leave the scientists behind. Now, the ways in which you might do this in practice, and I and my company do it in practice, is in theory and in practice. In theory, I do more or less what I explained earlier. You make sure you get all the assumptions that go behind a security protocol or problem explicitly out there, and you take a look at them, and you check if they're right. And maybe you change them. You generate alternative hypotheses. So we have our perception of problems, and we're going to think of as many other potential problems as we can that are feasible, given the actor, their means, and their motivation. I present these problems sometimes, and sometimes I test the alternative hypotheses first because there's just too many of them. And maybe some of them in practice aren't that useful as I thought on paper. And that's actually the step towards the practical red teaming, which is very much the pen testing and hacking that you guys do, I think. I don't know. I can't speak for all of you. So we get these realistic hypotheses, scenarios, methods of operation, as you will, and we try them out on a system, and we see what sticks. And those things that sticks, we either fix, or we get a warning and indicator system in place so that we can react as quickly as possible. It's an excellent way, through the modern purple teaming way of doing things, to assess and evaluate blue performance. How good is this organization at finding the problems? And it's an excellent way of testing our theory in reality. So you do it through the adversary perspective. What is their means? What is their motive? How can we predict what they might do next? So they're always going to try to do the easiest thing that has the highest rate of success. And sometimes we're fine trying to just look at the hacks, but as I've been told today, because I've been talking to a lot of you guys, and Ralph mentioned it, sometimes the hack isn't the hack. Sometimes the hack is a decoy, or the hack is a preparation. So we really need to get into the mindset, not just of the moment of hacking, but the preparation leading up to it. What do they do before the hack? Why do they pick us in the first place? How much information about our system is out there? And it's through that you really teach yourself to look at the problem not just as the problem as you perceive it, because you perceive it at the moment of the hack, but you might have a whole scope of problems before that are easier solved through security, not through policing, because very often what they do beforehand isn't hacking at all, and therefore the police really don't care. So we take an outside-in perspective of the problem, rather than an inside-out perspective. In the past years in which I've worked in security, something you see, good security managers, they can work a system, man. They can get a system working, and they can get all their walls in place and all their firewalls and systems, and it looks beautiful from the inside. And they're proud of that, and that's good. But a great security manager can do that, then step over that wall, look at it from the outside, and see, well, how can I weasel my way in through the cracks? Maybe not even through the cracks. I mean, how can I sidestep the wall entirely and just go in through another way, through a different gate? And that's how we get our 3 gates system. You can get in through hacking, but I mean, as far as I know, most systems are of themselves relatively reliable if you keep stuff up to date and just do what you're supposed to do. And it might not be the easiest way to get to a certain goal, be it information, be it money, whatever. Luckily, that's not the only way it's protected. Usually these systems and computers physically need to be in a space. That space needs to be protected as well. And usually, eventually at some point, at least for now, I've seen a couple of videos today that make me think something completely else, there's got to be a human involved at some point. And security is typically weakest where the responsibilities between these 3 gates and or overlap, because that's where things get fuzzy. That's walking on stage, asking a guy if that's his laptop and sticking the USB stick in it. That's walking up to a company, smoking outside with a couple of the employees on their smoking break and asking them to hold the door as you walk up behind them. Humans are typically the weakest factor in that they're the ones best at messing up the other factors. I also find they're usually quite strong if you inform them about all the ways in which they influence what might happen. And if they care enough about your company, they're your biggest help. So in this nice triangle graph, the things actually get thinnest where they overlap. So that's quite pleasing visually. I think. I'd like to finish off with a couple of practical examples from stuff that we've done. I rolled into this company out of university. While I was in university, I was working with Guillaume de Valk, and he had contacts in government and other places doing this sort of stuff, and I rolled into the company and continued doing it with the company. And I've looked for a couple of examples that I might use here. More or less anonymously, and in the form in which I'm doing them, I should be all right if I'm careful. So we were asked to red team the security of a political event of an international nature. It was big. It was across multiple cities. It was, I mean, there was political and business envoys from many different countries coming to the same small area. It was based on a topic that had its problems and people with motivation and means to start messing around with it. So we put together a small multidisciplinary team of public and private actors. We had people from responsible organizations for the security, and we had people who are, let's say, experienced in toying around with those organizations. They had a fun time together for a change. And they conducted a contrarian analysis and a minor exercise on all the existing security plans and protocols towards the end of the process. So all these plans have been made, and they're relatively secure. Now, here are all our plans. Take a look at them and try to shoot some holes into it. So there were a number of assumptions in this plan. There was a demonstration site for all the angry people in this country to go to say, yeah, we think that this is a terrible idea what you're doing here. All right, that's a good way to get rid of all these people. But how do you know that the people are actually going to go to the demonstration site? I mean, why would they? If they really are motivated to mess things up, they know they can't do that at the demonstration site. And there was a very Fort Knox approach to this problem. Most of the event was all in a relatively small geographical space that is relatively easily well protected. Some of the event was at external spaces that were more or less unprotected because there wasn't that much public knowledge about them, but there was some. Enough, possibly, for the two of those together, some of the more agitated people who might want to demonstrate to go to the other location. That's a problem of these two assumptions together. Third one was we had a number of agreements with third parties, namely hotels, about what they would do with rooms, what they would do with rooms the floor above rooms, and rooms below the floor, in which rooms were rented to officials. And one of the agreements was, well, don't rent out any of those 3 stories for 2 weeks beforehand. Well, that's an assessment easily tested 2 weeks beforehand. And as you might expect, theory and practice did not line up. A world top 5 museum. Once again, small multidisciplinary team of a bunch of, I mean, we had a chemist, we had a couple of political guys, we had a psychologist, and we threw in a spanner, namely an Ajax football hooligan, just to make sure that we got some street smarts in there. And they conducted a contrarian analysis and exercise on newly developed security protocols in this museum. One of the assumptions was, one of our neighbors is pretty high up, and they have actual counter-observation methods going on in our geographical area. They have people out there that are looking around for people who are doing stuff that they're not supposed to do. So considering that our outer physical ring is dependable, because there's no way anything happens out there and we don't hear about it possibly weeks beforehand. That was less easily tested. However, with 5 relatively non-criminal guys, just enough information, time, and planning, we were able to take pictures of these guys, get very close to finding their location headquarters where they worked from. We got number plates on cars they used. And as far as I know, I'm still allowed in the country where they're from. So they didn't see me. So I'm quite happy with that. Another one was, we didn't even need to go into the building. In their outer ring, we found a problem in a ventilation system that was very easily found, even just on the internet. I didn't need to go there, because the Dutch fire department is your friend if you're a criminal. They put everything online. Last one, it links into that critical infrastructure example I used before. An important one here, I'm going to speed things up a little. They assumed that they were the target. And considering that assumption, their security was quite good. Nobody was able to attack them and attack their goals. What they didn't assume was that they might be used as a step towards a bigger attack. And their security was not prepared for that. It's not a problem for that organization itself, but the responsible organization above it did think that that was something that needed to be looked at. And that was even just theoretical. So I'd like to leave you with three things before I go. Proof versus not missing possibilities. If you're working in security and you think there might be a problem, if it's not extremely expensive, always handle the possibility of a problem as if it is a problem. Because you're not trying to prove demonstrably that a problem is a problem. You're trying to take as many possibilities as there are and work with that. And let the guys with the money decide, which one to choose. Then that's not your responsibility anymore. You've given them all the problems. Red teaming should, beyond just the testing of a system, be seen as an experiment into the unknown. So get the whole system into play. Make sure you know all about it. Get as many attacks as you might know into play, and as much as you know about them, and then start working just outside of what you know. And find the easy ones. And the easy ones are the road of least resistance. So which gate or gates is that? Is it just your system, or is it who uses the system and where the system is? Thank you very much.